Homicide 1920, the case of 56-year-old Joseph Stewart. Joseph Stewart was convicted of the murder of 51-year-old Elizabeth Ann Skelton and sentenced to death but reprieved. They had previously cohabited, but the court heard that Elizabeth Skelton had given way to habits of intemperance, and their relationship was very unhappy, and they quarrelled a lot. On the night of the murder, Elizabeth Skelton had been to the pub with her daughter, and on their way home they stopped off at a fried fish and chip shop, and the daughter went in whilst Elizabeth Skelton went home. When Elizabeth Skelton got back, she met Joseph Stewart in a passage talking to another man, and as she approached, she started to accuse Joseph Stewart of saying something against her. Joseph Stewart denied saying anything against her, but she continued to accuse him, and was seen to raise her hand against him in a threatening manner. She then used a filthy expression, and Joseph Stewart was said to have said, "Oh, am I?" and then went upstairs, followed by Elizabeth Skelton's daughter and her children, who were crying. Moments later, Joseph Stewart came back down the stairs again, and was said to have cut Elizabeth Skelton's throat. Elizabeth Skelton's daughter then came down the stairs and saw Joseph Stewart and Elizabeth Skelton struggling and said, "See what you have done to my mother. I will fetch a policeman." And Joseph Stewart said, "Do not bother, I will." He then left. Elizabeth Skelton then got to her feet and staggered across the room, and as she tried to look into the mirror, she collapsed and fell into a kneeling position and died soon after. However, Joseph Stewart denied stabbing her intentionally and said that they tripped and that he had landed on top of her, and that the knife that he had had in his hand to cut tobacco had gone into her neck. The police found that she had a 1 1/4 inch wound that had cut both the internal and external jugular veins, and the doctor said that it would have been impossible to have saved her life. Joseph Stewart had been a roadman and had been employed by the Durham Corporation for 34 years, and was later given a very good character by the police. In 1918 he had gone to lodge in the house of Elizabeth Skelton, a widow, and then cohabited with her. She had occupied a small 4-room cottage at 13 New Elvet in Durham, along with her daughter and her 3 illegitimate children. Elizabeth Skelton was described as a woman of doubtful character, and since 1890 she had been convicted 8 times for riotous behaviour, assault and drunkenness. Elizabeth Skelton and Joseph Stewart were said to have frequently quarrelled owing to Elizabeth Skelton's drunken habits, and Joseph Stewart once left her as a result for a time and lodged elsewhere. However, he finally returned to 13 New Elvet and occupied a room by himself at the top of the stairs. Joseph Stewart said that Elizabeth Skelton had wanted him to resume cohabitation with her, but that on account of her drunken habits he didn't do so. On the night of the 17th of May 1920, Joseph Stewart had been standing outside 13 New Elvet with some men friends when Elizabeth Skelton appeared, drunk and noisy. Joseph Stewart then made some remark to his friends, which Elizabeth Skelton thought reflected on her, and she started to abuse him for calling her names, and called him a rotten sod, to which Joseph Stewart was alleged to have replied, "Oh, am I? Just stand there and I will show you." Joseph Stewart was said to have then run upstairs, and then down again and into the kitchen, where he was said to have been seen to force Elizabeth Skelton back onto the floor, holding her throat. Elizabeth Skelton's daughter said that she tried to pull Joseph Stewart off, and saw that Elizabeth Skelton had a wound in her throat, and said that she would go for the police, but that Joseph Stewart replied that she had no need, as he would go himself. Joseph Stewart then went out to the police station and said, "If someone will go to 13 New Elvet, I think they will find a woman there with her throat cut, and I am the man that done it." 2 knives were found on him. One was a buckhorn pocket knife, and the other, Joseph Stewart said, "That's the one I done it with." It was later found that Elizabeth Skelton had been able to stagger across the room after she was stabbed, but to have soon collapsed. She was found to have a stab wound to the lower part of the right side of her neck, just below the Adam's apple, that had severed her jugular vein. It was noted that it could have been done with the buckhorn knife. However, at the trial, the defence was that Elizabeth Skelton's death was accidental. Joseph Stewart said that he had gone upstairs to get out of the row, and that Elizabeth Skelton had followed him up, and that at the time he had been in the act of cutting his tobacco to fill his pipe, and that he had then gone out of his room and made a gesture to Elizabeth Skelton to go downstairs, and that she didn't go down, and that he followed her. He said that she then got hold of his waistcoat at the door of the sitting room and then tripped over the mat, and that he fell on top of her, and in the fall his knife, which had remained in his right hand, must have gone into her neck. He denied having said, "Oh, am I? Just stand there and I'll show you." He also said that just before he went upstairs, that Elizabeth Skelton made a sort of dash at him, as if to scratch him. After hearing the evidence at the trial, the judge suggested that there might have been another view that might be true if the jury came to the conclusion that Joseph Stewart was telling half the truth, namely that he had forgotten that he had had the knife in his hand, and that they had started to quarrel and struggle, and that in the course of the struggle, without Joseph Stewart driving the knife at her intentionally, she had got cut in the throat. However, the jury rejected Joseph Stewart's defence and convicted him of murder with a strong recommendation to mercy, in which the judge said he concurred. Joseph Stewart appealed his conviction, stating that it should have been manslaughter. However, the judge pointed out that defence was not raised at the trial, and that at any rate, the facts necessarily to support it were not consistent with the story told by Joseph Stewart himself, and his appeal was dismissed. Joseph Stewart's sentence was then commuted to penal servitude for life. He was later released from Parkhurst Prison on the 28th of June 1930.